Hey there, leaders and community builders. Welcome. If you've ever felt like you're pouring your heart and soul into building an inclusive team, but you keep hitting a wall, you're in exactly the right place. We are about to dig into why the old rules of leadership might be the very thing holding you and your team back. Let's get into it. You're putting in the work, right? You're trying to create that sense of belonging, but something just isn't clicking. If that sounds at all familiar, I just want you to know that frustration, it is so real, it is super common, and it's probably not because you're failing. It might be because the entire model you've been taught to use is, frankly, broken.
You see, for generations, our culture has basically worshipped this idea of the separate self, a model built on going it alone, on individual power. But what if that's the wrong story? What if that's not how humans are wired to thrive? Today, we're going to explore a totally different framework, one where real growth, real strength, doesn't come from separation at all. It comes from connection.
So before we can really build up this new model, we kind of have to deconstruct the old one. We've got to take a hard look at this powerful myth that has shaped so much of our world.
I mean, just think about our heroes for a second. Traditional psychology, movies, you name it, they all celebrate the Lone Ranger archetype, right? The rugged individual who rides into town, solves the problem all by himself, and then just rides off into the sunset. We're taught from a young age that the goal is to stand strong, alone, and to be totally invulnerable.
And look at how these values play out in the real world. Self-enhancement, power over others, what does that create? It creates a world where we are all just scrambling up a ladder, a lot of times climbing over each other to try and get to the top. And this isn't just a mindset, it's like a social script we all learn, one that hardwires competition into our organizations and just completely undermines the collaboration we desperately need.
So what happens when an entire culture is built on this shaky foundation of separation? Well, the cost is absolutely enormous, and it shows up in ways we might not even recognize at first. This right here is a core insight from what's called relational cultural theory, or RCT. It's a huge idea. It suggests that the loneliness, the burnout, the conflicts we see all around us, they're not just individual failings. No, they're symptoms of a culture that is constantly whispering to us that we don't belong, or that we'll only belong if we hide the real parts of who we are. And this is what you get. The whole separate self idea naturally creates what we call a power over culture. It's basically a system of hierarchies where some people are put above others, and your value, your worth, is decided by your rank. This isn't about creating order. It's about maintaining control and ultimately inequality. And this right here is the crucial piece of the puzzle. Disconnection isn't just a personal feeling of sadness. It is a political tool. When people are isolated from each other, systems of oppression and injustice can thrive completely unchallenged. So what does that mean? It means building connection isn't just a nice leadership strategy. It's a powerful act of social change. Okay, but here's the good news. There is a different story we can tell ourselves. A much more hopeful, more human, and in the end, a much more powerful story. So let's turn to this revolutionary alternative, relational cultural theory. I absolutely love this origin story because it's like the theory itself in miniature. See, RCT didn't come from some sterile university lab or a top-down institution. Nope, it was born back in the early 80s in a psychiatrist's living room, Jean Baker Miller's living room to be exact. She and 3 colleagues started meeting there just to talk because they felt like all the existing psychological theories just didn't speak to their experiences as women. So you can see how this whole thing unfolded. It started really simply, with them just looking for support in these very patriarchal institutions. But after a few years of meeting, Jean Baker Miller knew they had something much bigger. She pushed them to present their ideas at a huge conference. One of them, Judith Jordan, remembers being terrified of public speaking. But Miller told her, "Judy, this is literal about voice. You have to use your voice." And they did. They got up there, and they sparked a movement. Okay, so to really use this theory, we have to wrap our heads around this one key dynamic that plays out in all of our lives, especially when we've been hurt. It's called the relational paradox. All right, let's break this down because it's so important. As humans, we are fundamentally wired for connection. But when our attempts to connect are met with rejection or misunderstanding or worse, we learn to protect ourselves. So we start hiding the parts of us we think are unacceptable or too much. And in doing that, we actually prevent the very connection we are so desperate for. It's this painful, vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. This story, wow, it just makes the paradox so incredibly painfully clear. Ruth and Saul were Holocaust survivors who moved to the United States, and they were surrounded by people, but they felt profoundly alone. And why? Because to fit in, to feel safe, they made a conscious choice to hide their Jewish identity. They hid the very part of themselves that held their history, their rituals, their resilience. By hiding who they truly were, they literally guaranteed their own disconnection. So, understanding that paradox, that's step one. The next step is learning how to actively fight against it in our own leadership. So let's get practical. Let's turn to some strategies you can start using today to lead with connection.
All right, here are 3 strategies that will literally change the game. First, stop pretending power doesn't exist. Saying, oh, we're all equal here, when you're the one signing the paychecks, is just not true, and it can actually be an abuse of power. Just acknowledge it. Second, and this is huge, actively practice being influenced. How often are you really willing to let your team change your mind? That flexibility isn't weakness, it's the hallmark of relational leadership. And third, remember that the whole point of your structural power is to reduce the power gap over time, to help others grow into their own authority.
Okay, let me paint you a picture. Here's a real-world example of this in action from Maureen Walker. She was teaching a graduate course, and the final paper had to be in this really strict academic APA format. But one student, who'd been pretty quiet all semester, turned in a long, beautiful prose poem instead. So put yourself in her shoes for a second. The rules are crystal clear. You could fail her. That's the power over response, right? It protects the rules, it protects your authority. But what does a relational leader do? Walker's response was immediate. She looked at the poem and said, "This is perfect." She saw that the student hadn't just ignored an assignment, she had synthesized the entire course and transformed it into a piece of art. To fail her would have been to use power just to protect power itself. Instead, Walker chose to use her power to recognize and champion that student's growth. That is leading with connection. Now, I know this can all sound great, but it can also feel a little daunting. So as we start to wrap up, let's reframe this whole thing. This isn't a new set of rules to follow. Think of it as an invitation. Becoming a relational leader isn't about checking off a bunch of boxes. It's an ongoing practice of awareness, of humility, of being intentional. It's an aspiration. And look, some days you're going to nail it, and other days you're going to fall right back into those old, comfortable patterns. And that's okay. The real goal is just to keep learning and to keep trying. And maybe the best tool you can have on this journey is a whole new understanding of what respect actually is. According to Maureen Walker, respect isn't about agreeing with someone. It's about curiosity. It's the ability to look at someone whose experience is completely different from yours and simply say, "Tell me more." It's an active invitation to connect across all of our differences. So I'll leave you with this final thought to take with you. Just think about your day ahead, the meetings you have, the conversations you're going to be a part of. Where is your very next opportunity to consciously choose connection over control, curiosity over certainty, mutuality over hierarchy? The answer to that question really could change everything.